Now look, she made the statement about Hillary Clinton. I've heard the statement for years. I had no idea it was Michelle Obama. She made the statement that if you can't take care of your own house, you can't take care of the White House. You know, I've heard that.
Trump starts by bringing up a comment that many people have heard for years, saying he never even realized it originally came from Michelle Obama because it had been repeated so often. The quote itself is pretty simple. If someone can't manage their own household, how can they be trusted to manage the White House? At first, it comes across as a straightforward observation, but in politics, even the most familiar statements can carry a lot more weight than they seem to on the surface. Trump presents it as a line that has been part of the public conversation for so long that it almost feels separate from the person who first said it. But the moment he specifically connects the quote back to Michelle Obama, the conversation starts to change. What once sounded like a general political remark suddenly becomes tied to a well-known figure, giving it a much more personal feel. And that's often where political debates become more intense, because the focus shifts away from the words themselves and toward what people think the speaker is really trying to do. Was it simply a reference to a famous quote? Or was it a deliberate way of raising questions about someone's credibility without making a direct attack? Those are the kinds of questions that make moments like this resonate far beyond the original comment, turning a single quote into a much larger discussion about intent, perception, and the way political messages are delivered.
I've seen Michelle passionate in this election.
Yes.
Part of the reason that we get involved as much as we have is not just because we think Hillary's going to be a great president, but it's also because there is something qualitatively different about.
The conversation takes a different direction when Barack Obama steps in and widens the focus. Instead of responding directly to the earlier comment, he looks at the bigger picture and explains why people like Michelle Obama felt such a strong need to get involved during the election. He makes it clear that their involvement wasn't based only on the belief that Hillary Clinton would be a capable president. According to Obama, there was something else happening that made that political moment feel unlike anything voters had experienced before. What really stands out is the way he describes it as being qualitatively different. He doesn't immediately break down everything behind that phrase, but the wording itself carries a lot of significance. It suggests that the issue goes well beyond the usual campaign battles or standard partisan disagreements. Instead, it points to a much deeper contrast in leadership style, political behavior, and the way candidates choose to communicate with the public. That distinction quietly shifts the entire conversation. Suddenly, the audience isn't just thinking about a single quote or one exchange anymore. They're being asked to compare two very different approaches to politics, two different ideas of public leadership, and two competing ways of connecting with voters. That's the moment when the discussion becomes much more meaningful, because what started as commentary on one statement grows into a broader debate about the direction, tone, and character of political discourse itself.
Obama's speech last night where she said that you're in over your head and the wrong president for the
No, she
country.
was over her head, and frankly, she should have made the speech live, which she didn't do. She taped it, and it was not only taped, it was taped a long time ago because she had the wrong deaths. She didn't even mention the vice presidential candidate.
The conversation becomes much more direct when Trump is asked to respond to Michelle Obama's speech, where she argued that he wasn't prepared for the job and wasn't the right choice for president. But instead of focusing entirely on the criticism itself, Trump quickly shifts the discussion toward how the speech was delivered. He pushes back by arguing that Michelle Obama was the one who seemed out of her depth, and he criticizes the fact that the speech was pre-recorded rather than delivered live. He also claims that it had been recorded well before it was released, pointing to what he describes as outdated information and noting that there was no mention of the vice presidential nominee. At that point, the debate starts moving away from the original criticism and toward questions about credibility and presentation. The spotlight isn't just on the message anymore, it's on the circumstances surrounding it. Suddenly, details like whether the speech was live or taped, when it was recorded, and what information it included become major parts of the discussion. It's a familiar pattern in politics, where responding to a strong argument sometimes means challenging the way it was presented rather than addressing every point head-on. As a result, the conversation develops a second layer. Viewers are encouraged to think not only about the claims being made, but also about whether those claims were delivered in a transparent and accurate way. Questions about timing, context, and presentation begin competing with the original political message for attention. And as the discussion continues, it drifts even further from a single speech and expands into a broader debate about trust, authenticity, and the strategies people use to shape public perception. If you're enjoying this breakdown and appreciate straightforward explanations that keep the full context intact, subscribing to the channel is a great way to stay updated and follow the conversation as it continues to evolve.
Is prouder to put this birth certificate matter to rest than the Donald. And that's because he can finally get back to focusing on the issues that matter, like Did we
One of the most memorable moments comes when Barack Obama shifts away from direct political commentary and leans into a carefully delivered joke that immediately grabs the audience's attention. He remarks that nobody is more eager than Donald Trump to move past the birth certificate controversy, joking that doing so would finally free him up to focus on other important questions, like whether the moon landing was staged. The audience laughs, but the moment lands because it's doing more than just delivering a punchline. It's a sharp example of political satire being used with purpose. By taking a widely debated issue and extending it to an even more extreme example, Obama highlights what he sees as a pattern of distractions that can pull public attention away from more meaningful topics. What makes the moment especially effective is the way he delivers it. There's no anger, no raised voice, and no attempt to be confrontational. Instead, he stays calm, measured, and completely in control, letting the humor do the work. That composure actually gives the joke more power because it encourages the audience to think instead of simply react. The humor operates on two levels at once. On the surface, it's entertaining and gets an easy laugh, but underneath it pushes people to consider why certain stories gain so much attention in politics and how public focus can sometimes be redirected toward issues that dominate headlines despite ongoing questions about their relevance. In the end, it's criticism wrapped in wit, where the joke becomes a vehicle for a larger point about political discourse, public attention, and the kinds of stories that end up shaping national conversations.
blame to go around, but you, Mr. Trump, recognize that the real problem was a lack of leadership. And so ultimately you didn't blame Little John or Meatloaf. You fired Gary Busey. And these are the kind of
Obama keeps building on the joke by bringing in familiar pop culture names and reality TV references, using humor to guide the audience toward a bigger point. He jokes that while plenty of people could share responsibility for the situation, Trump supposedly figured out that the real problem was a failure of leadership and, instead of blaming figures like Lil Jon or Meat Loaf, decided to fire Gary Busey. On the surface, it's a funny line that gets an easy laugh, but there's a lot more going on beneath it than just comedy. Rather than delivering a direct political attack, Obama uses recognizable entertainment references to illustrate what he sees as a particular approach to decision-making. By relying on exaggerated examples that people immediately understand, he makes a more complicated argument feel simple and accessible. The humor acts as a bridge, allowing the audience to connect with the underlying message without feeling like they're sitting through a formal political lecture. What emerges is a clear contrast between the realities of governing and the storytelling style often associated with entertainment culture. That's where the joke gets much of its strength. People laugh at the reference, but at the same time they're encouraged to think about broader questions involving leadership, judgment, and the difference between managing public responsibilities and creating compelling television moments. By wrapping criticism inside familiar cultural references, Obama delivers a message that feels light and entertaining on the surface while still carrying a deeper political point underneath.
What really happened in Roswell? And where are Biggie and Tupac?
The joke continues to build as Obama adds even more attention-grabbing mysteries to the mix, bringing up things like Roswell and the long-running questions surrounding Biggie and Tupac. With every new reference, the larger message becomes more obvious. At this point, he's not just telling jokes for the sake of getting laughs. He's using well-known conspiracy theories and cultural mysteries to make a point about how public conversations can sometimes drift away from concrete policy issues and toward stories fueled by curiosity, speculation, and media fascination. The humor works because these examples are instantly recognizable, allowing the audience to understand the connection without needing a long explanation. Beneath the laughter is a broader observation about the way information spreads in modern society. Certain topics capture enormous attention not necessarily because they're the most important or supported by the strongest evidence, but because they're intriguing, dramatic, and easy to share. Obama uses these examples to highlight that reality, pointing out how media cycles often reward whatever generates the most interest rather than what carries the greatest practical importance. As a result, the audience is encouraged to think more carefully about how public attention is shaped, why some stories dominate headlines while others barely get noticed, and how entertainment value can sometimes outweigh substance when it comes to deciding what people talk about. The comedy keeps everything light and engaging, but the larger point remains clear. The stories that rise to the top of public conversation are often influenced just as much by their ability to attract attention as by their actual significance or policy impact.
You gotta win. You know, I've watched a lot of people, leaders, great leaders. And you know, the one thing about sports is you break it down into, a 2-hour period, something nice. You don't have to wait a lifetime to find out is somebody a winner or a loser. You got a lot of losers, mostly losers.
It's winning. you got to win. You know, I've watched a lot of people, leaders, great leaders. And you know, the one thing about sports is you break it down into, you know, a 2-hour period, something nice. You don't have to wait a lifetime to find out, is somebody a winner or a loser? You got a lot of losers.
At this point, the conversation takes another interesting turn as the focus shifts away from the back-and-forth exchanges and toward a much bigger question. The discussion is no longer centered only on Trump as an individual, but on how political figures capture and hold public attention. From this perspective, a large part of the attention surrounding Trump comes not necessarily from how unique his ideas are, but from the way he presents them. The argument is that other candidates may raise similar concerns or discuss many of the same issues, yet they often do it in ways that attract far less public interest. That observation moves the conversation beyond policy and into the realm of communication itself. It highlights a reality of modern politics where visibility is often shaped just as much by presentation as by substance. In many cases, the wording, tone, and overall style of a message can be every bit as influential as the message itself. That helps explain why some political figures consistently dominate headlines, social media discussions, and public debate, while others struggle to gain the same level of attention even when addressing comparable topics. The focus becomes less about what is being said on its own and more about how it is packaged, delivered, and remembered. Ultimately, the larger point is that in today's media landscape, communication style has become a powerful force in its own right. Capable of shaping public perception and determining which voices remain at the center of political conversations long after the original remarks have faded from view.
I don't think it's restricted, by the way, to Mr. Trump. I mean, I find it interesting that everybody's focused on Trump primarily just because he says in more interesting ways what the other candidates are saying as well.
The discussion eventually arrives at a theme that sits right at the center of Trump's public image, competition, achievement, and the idea of winning. Leadership is presented almost like a contest with clear outcomes, where success and failure are easy to recognize and results are expected to speak for themselves. Within that framework, there's less focus on lengthy analysis or complicated evaluations and more emphasis on whether a leader appears to deliver victories. That perspective creates a sharp contrast with many of the other viewpoints that have emerged throughout the conversation. Looking back, the audience has seen several different communication styles collide and compete for influence. There has been satire designed to make people think, criticism aimed at challenging credibility, defensive responses intended to redirect the conversation, and direct arguments centered on performance and achievement. Each approach reflects a different belief about what leadership should look like and how political messages should be communicated. By the end, the audience isn't given a simple answer or a single conclusion. Instead, they're left weighing these competing visions against one another. The way leaders choose to speak, the methods they use to respond to criticism, and the standards they use to define success all shape how their messages are received. Ultimately, political storytelling goes far beyond the words themselves. Its lasting impact comes from how those words are delivered, how often they're repeated, and how deeply they remain in public memory long after the moment has passed. What started as a discussion about a well-known quote connected to Michelle Obama gradually expanded into a much broader conversation about intention, credibility, leadership, media influence, and public perception. Along the way, Barack Obama introduced a contrasting style built around explanation, satire, and carefully measured criticism, while Trump responded with a communication approach focused on direct challenges, counterarguments, and questions of authenticity. The discussion then widened even further as commentators examined the role of presentation and media dynamics in determining which voices dominate public attention. Together, these exchanges highlight a central reality of modern politics: communication is never just about the information being shared. It's also about framing, timing, tone, repetition, and audience reaction. Every statement carries meaning beyond its literal words because people interpret not only what leaders say, but how they say it and why they choose to say it that way. By the end of the story, the focus has shifted away from any single controversy and toward a larger comparison of competing leadership styles and communication philosophies. The audience is ultimately encouraged to think about how political narratives are created, amplified, and remembered, recognizing that in today's media environment, the battle for attention can be just as influential as the debate over policy itself.